Someday I'll picture this when I'm far away from this place. There'll be oceans divide us, but I'll keep inside me this time and space. Soon I may fade away, like the sun falling down in the west at the end of the day, and I'll be a ghost of your memory.
And I am your vicious share. I am Peter Gilmore, and I have the distinction of being not only an historian, but as you can see, an historical artifact. Blessed are the faithful remnant who overcome the artifices and snares of temptation. Temptation in this case being the urge to stay in bed on such a morning. But your reward is another day of stimulating, substantial, thought-provoking presentations. And we begin this morning with one such panel discussing the important issues of the diaspora and creating a new home. So I invite you to demonstrate your respect and appreciation for Dr. Sophie Cooper, who has taken on the bold task of being the first speaker on the morning after the night before. So, Sophie Cooper.
And she didn't partake on the night before, let me tell you.
All right, Liam.
You did. Oh, sorry, Sophie, sorry. No, musically.
My save.
Yeah.
Have your dad know that my dad was most proud of me for being able to down a pint of beer when I was younger. Anyway, so good morning. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you as ever to Paddy and Liam for being spectacular, and also to Peter for his chairmanship. So today I want to focus on adaptation and how migrants try to facilitate a sense of belonging in their new homes. So Sister Mary Vincent Whitty wrote from the Convent of Mercy in Western Australia to Mother Mary of Mercy Norris at the Baggot Street Convent in Dublin in 1861, that you can scarcely imagine the joy of letters from home, for I believe colonists will always call Ireland by this name of home, although every May we are getting more and more at home here on account of the arrival of emigrants. And when I discuss this with students, including when I bring students to this fine place, the sense of home and home frequently comes up. When you talk about what your parents, where your parents live, that's home, but home is just where you're going back to tonight. So when does home become home? And how do immigrants help to create that sense of belonging? And perhaps the contentedness or familiarity that means home to so many of us. And this is something that I'm increasingly looking at in my work, building on the research and arguments that I developed during my PhD and in the years afterwards, which culminated in my book, which is over there if you want to look at it. And also some articles in which I've focused more on materiality and how people, especially women, used physical items, the stuff of life, to shape their environments, or use the material available to them to engage with different parts of their identities. And something I'm going to talk a bit about Australia, I'm going to talk a bit about the States, but something that I want us to keep in mind is something I noticed on William's slide yesterday, that people aren't just going from A to B. They're often going to Melbourne, then Ontario, then Boston. And all the time that they're doing that, they're taking with them knowledge of what people are doing in other places to facilitate that sense of home. And it's not just the people who move from multiple places. We're talking often about the 1850s. Yes, a time of famine, but also a time of gold rushes. You have people going from Ireland to Melbourne to California to New Zealand. Scotland had a gold rush. It was very short-lived. but some of them went there and then they would continue on. So people are moving, but they're also exchanging letters. They're building on knowledge that other people already have. So I kind of approach this in a rather transnational approach. We impose borders on the world. The way people think aren't necessarily bounded by them. So my book specifically looked at the Irish communities in Melbourne in Australia and Chicago in the US during the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I wanted to use comparison to consider how these communities in two rather different cities differed and aligned with each other. So obviously these very diverse communities, but the comparison brought out some really interesting similarities which allowed me to consider differing influences on Irish identity in the diaspora over multiple generations. Traditionally, those who went to the US have been portrayed as more militant and as holding on more tightly to their Irishness, whereas those who went to Australia are seen as kind of letting go of their Irishness and any sense of loyalty to their homeland and became or remained loyal British citizens. Even Irish nationalists who stayed in Australia after being transported for their involvement in the 1848 rebellion or in the Young Islanders were presented as milk and honey Irishmen who gave up on their views as soon as they reached the Australian colonies. As with all generalizations, these stereotypes flatten the realities and ignore some of the, in my humble opinion, most interesting aspects of these Irish communities and how they maintained or lost their Irishness over multiple generations. So I'm going to start by thinking about some of the similarities that I found between the two places, so often described as opposites. And then I'll move more into my new research, which focuses more on the ways that individuals or particular groups of migrants adapted to their specific context. And as I mentioned, some of these case studies are in Melbourne and Chicago. I also take in other places, largely New York and Western Australia. And in looking at these examples, I want us to move from thinking just about how Irish migrants in the 19th century adapted to their new home and the societies that they entered, but also to consider how they adapted those new homes to help them develop that sense of home and belonging. So Melbourne and Chicago in the 19th century were worlds apart. One was a proud part of the British Empire, a beacon of colonial loyalty and made up principally of migrants from Great Britain and Ireland. The other was quickly becoming the second city of the US, a heartland of crime and wealth, and as those in the pub will know, I really enjoy learning about crime and wealth. But it's also increasingly ethnically pluralistic. So as you can see from this graph, until the 1870s, Melbourne and Chicago were increasing population-wise at a very similar rate. They're within, a couple of, hundreds at times. And I think so often we hear about the huge amounts of people going to the US and the few that are going to Australia. But actually, at this time, both are settled in the early 1830s by Europeans. They are kind of moving at a similar rate. As I said, they're both settled by Europeans in the 1830s, expanding on settlements and thriving trading places of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. It was earlier known as Batman Hill within the Port Phillip district. My PhD supervisor would circle it and put ha 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 every time. And that I've been told I have to say this with an American accent, the Potawatomis. Thank you. I said it wrong in Notre Dame, and then I got corrected, and I've been practicing, but clearly the nerves got to me, so thank you very much. But that group in Chicago, which is originally known as Chicago, the wild garlic place. And in the 1850s, Chicago benefited from the opening up of the West, the coming of the railroads, and the growing markets and industry, which brought people to their doors. As I've mentioned, Melbourne also boomed in that decade due to the gold rushes. So Melbourne's largely made up of migrants from Great Britain and Ireland, whereas in Chicago, it's largely a mix of Germans, Poles, Scandinavians, and also those from Britain and Ireland. But despite this larger mix, the Irish-born communities in Melbourne and Chicago made up a very similar size relative to local population during this time period. In fact, throughout this time period. You can see even in 1890, they're making up within a percentage point of each other as Irish-born as a percentage of the total population. And this is actually really, really interesting to me because the actual numbers are hugely different, like 30,000 versus 70,000. But if we're actually thinking about the impact that they have within society, that population percentage is actually really important and really interesting. And my accountant father was very proud of me for being able to do the percentages. So they make useful comparisons. Now, the Irish who made their way to Melbourne and Chicago were generally different to each other. Those who made their way to Melbourne tended to be from a higher social class to those who went to Chicago. Melbourne was further away, so you had to have more money to buy passage. And even if you went on assisted passage, unless you were, for example, a what's known as the Earl Grey Girls, I've got issues with that name, but you usually still had to provide a couple of pounds towards the cost. However, despite this overriding image of strong farmers and risk-taking second sons, from the 1850s, Victoria had the lowest number of Irish migrants taking up the option of assisted passage in all of the Australian colonies. Instead, most Irish migrants relied on chain migration. And we talked about this before, but family members and friends who'd gone over earlier, either as convicts to Tasmania or New South Wales or on earlier assisted passages. In fact, when the Victorian Legislative Assembly debated about how to change who could take advantage of assistance through immigration agents, it was pointed out that trying to dissuade Irish Catholic migrants through that means was pointless because they already got their tickets from their friends. Dave Fitzpatrick has found that many Irish immigrants to the Australian colonies during the mid-19th century were from the Ulster border counties. Cavan, as we know, has a strong showing, and also the Midlands. Those who went to Chicago were from a mix of backgrounds, but according to research done by Tyler Ambinder and Hope McCaffrey, during and in the immediate aftermath of the famine, they were often from the northern half of Ireland, encompassing many counties that were less dramatically affected by the effects of the famine, meaning that people who were struggling, but not struggling with life or death choices, could emigrate. And chain migration helped with this as well. And creating a solid club life was a priority for the so-called kind of middle crust of both societies, but especially so in Melbourne in the 1840s. And this was kind of echoing the norms of life at home. The St. Patrick's Society in Melbourne was established in July 1842, reflecting, if not representative of the mixed denominational makeup of the Irish in Melbourne. So the original committee of the St. Patrick's Society had 9 Episcopalians, 5 Presbyterians and 5 Catholics, and proclaimed that any person of whatever political creed or religious denomination, being a native of Ireland or descended from Irish parents, shall be eligible as a member. In a town at that point that had a population of 4,500, Irish people made up about a quarter of that, 127 people joined the society. They made up quite a big percentage of Melbourne's middle crust. They had to pay the 5 shilling entrance fee and the 12 shilling annual fee. And looking briefly at the founding committee gives some insights into that Irish world that migrants entered into in the 1840s. The honorary secretary of the St. Patrick's Society, T.H. Osborne, was described by Edmund Finn, a 19th century chronicler, as a retired Presbyterian minister and a more devoted son of the Emerald Isle never existed in Victoria. Osborne, who had been born in Belfast, had moved to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, with a licence from the moderator of the Bangor Presbytery in 1835. In 1840, he crossed from Van Diemen's Land to Port Phillip, later part of Melbourne. He, a retired Presbyterian minister, married Mary Keeley at St Francis's Roman Catholic Church in Melbourne, and after editing a number of early newspapers in Melbourne, he moved to Portland and then to Port Fairy, which is also known as Belfast. And while the committee emphasised its non-sectarian and non-political foundations, this didn't last particularly long. Finn, perhaps slightly tongue-in-cheek, noted that fellow committee member, John C. King, was, in his words, so enamoured of Erin go Bragh and so careful that neither North or South should have a reason to complain that he determined to be impartial in the distribution of his favours. And so, having assisted in and figuratively planting the shamrock in 1842 by helping to initiate a St. Patrick's Society, in the next year he good-naturedly lent a hand to the culture of the Orange Lilies and set up the Orange Order there. These two societies would then have so many fights. Like, it's useful to have a hurling match on the 12th of July. Just, a friendly match where everyone has sticks. So all processions and parades were then banned for the next 22 years because of the violence. But, all good-natured. So when considering who facilitated a visible and identifiably Irish community life in Melbourne and Chicago, we do have to focus a bit on the Catholic Church. It retained the cultural power to both bind and loosen ethnic identity in Ireland and abroad, according to Colin Barr and Hilary Carey. And Willie Jenkins has also argued that the interactions which took place within visible neighbourhood institutions, such as churches and schools, affected the sorts of conversations and routine practices that were undertaken elsewhere in diasporic life. And religious orders provided a visible and vocal Catholic presence in both cities. However, as I've mentioned, Melbourne and Chicago had different religious backgrounds. William Quarter, who sets up the parish system in Chicago in 1844, immediately sets up an ethnic parish system. So Irish people go to Irish schools, they go to Irish churches, they bring in Irish nuns and Irish priests from Ireland to cater to them. German kids go to German schools, and they bring in nuns from the different German states to cater to them. So your ethnicity and your religion are automatically brought together because you're kind of competing within the Catholic Church. Whereas in Melbourne, basically everyone who is Catholic is Irish. So you can separate your Irishness from your religion to a certain extent. This wasn't always the case. So in 1853, there are a few Scottish congregants in Melbourne, Scottish Catholics. And they asked the Bishop of Melbourne to write to his counterpart in Glasgow to request that a Gaelic-speaking priest be sent to the colony so that they could worship in their own language. They were very specific in this request, asking that the Reverend Ronald Rankin of Inverness, a clergyman known by many of the subscribers and who they are satisfied is well qualified to cater to their spiritual interests, and then they offer to defray the costs of bringing him. A Gaelic-speaking Presbyterian community was also established in 1842 in the Protestant Hall, but it didn't last long, and the minister soon began preaching in English. However, there is a resurgence. This happens over the years where there's more demand for Gaelic Gaelic language services. So, one thing, I realise I've only got 3 minutes. So, so while each city had different Catholic church setups, there were substantial overlaps. Women religious or nuns, soon to be joined by their male counterparts, provided an alternative option to state-sanctioned and Protestant-influenced institutions. In this way, they created a sense of belonging to and dependence on the religious parish, which was imperative to the future Catholic family units of the city. particularly within areas of society where networks of financial and familial support were unavailable. Women were regarded as the primary providers of moral and religious education in the young. And if this provision didn't come from nuns, it was provided by mothers, aunts, and sisters. Religious education and education generally was imperative. And we can see this when we look at the spatial the priorities of these different groups. So if we look at the 1855 Surveyor's Map, if we just, you might not be able to see the map, the arrows, but if we're just looking for churches, remember this is a city, it's a town really, that is just described as mud. Like that's the big descriptor, mud. But we've got a Presbyterian church, a Methodist church, St. John's Church, St. Francis's Church, the Scottish Church, the Jewish synagogue next to St. Patrick's Hall, which was actually, St. Patrick's Hall became the Parliament for years before the Victorian Parliament was built. So that also shows Irish people have an influence because they've got the biggest hall in the whole of Melbourne at this point. Church, 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 church. Most of these churches, if they are Catholic, have a school next to them. So the twin priorities of education and religion are kind of there right from the start. Even though at this point, like the nuns haven't arrived, there's about 8 priests for the entirety of Victoria, which is a size of 3 times Ireland. And then we look at Chicago. They've got less of an emphasis on education, but still, 1853, again, this is marshland, so the reason that the migrants have quite a big say in what happens in Chicago is because they're literally lifting the city. Like, it all has to be raised. So we've got church, 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 church. Like, this is just in a, however many blocks that is. These are the priorities. So we can see that, if we look at this, also you've got the Catholic Church right opposite the immigration depot. Like the minute you come in, here's the church. You also have, other churches. But then we also have over here, where is it? Oh yeah, there's more schools there. We've got the Scottish Hall, we've got the hotel. All of these next to the new House of Parliament that's being built. You also have kind of the 2 big grammar schools. You've got the Catholic grammar school and you've got the Presbyterian grammar school. These are in competition, and when the Catholic school doesn't go or isn't doing spectacularly later on, people start sending their kids to the Presbyterian one. So religion and education have an interesting kind of they can play. They work in different ways. So I've largely been speaking about the subjects focused upon in my book, and I've recently been thinking more about how Irish immigrants sought to not just adapt to their new context, but also how they tried to bend their new context to feel like home, or at least to try and find a sense of belonging. We know plenty of people were doing this. If you look at the diaries of women travelling to Australia in the mid-19th century, they're filled with comparisons to home. Clara Aspinall, for example, who visited Melbourne between 1858 and 61, delighted that it cannot certainly bear comparison to British scenery. At the same time, I must add that when I have seen some very pretty spots and some very fine views in Australia, but when this happened to me, my first exclamation always was, how very lovely, how very English. So there's a clear wish to grasp the new opportunities of life abroad while also attempting to claw back some sense of familiarity. So for those who moved and lived apart from their family, who were unable to bring many belongings with them, or, as was the case for most, had no expectation of returning home in their lifetimes, claiming a sense of belonging to a new place and leaving some sense of familial bequest to future generations was key. And how this was achieved depending on class, gender, and access to resources. Now, we often see in churches, I am relatively close to finishing, the names of men. These are all names of men. The names on foundation stones and plaques, men, but also we hear largely about the men who shaped Irish community identity abroad, the bishops, the politicians, the business owners. So I think we should bring other people in, personally. So Ellen Skerritt writes about brick and mortar Catholicism, in which the built environment acted as a physical demanding of space and public presence for minority groups. You could do this through taking up space for a parade, but you could also do it through building grand buildings. And women were crucial in fundraising for these institutions. Some fundraisers sought to recreate a sense of home, such as this altar in New York St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is a replica of an altar in Louth and features St. Patrick and Bridget. Many of the nods to women's belonging to a parish are done after their deaths, as seen here in Old St. Patrick's in Chicago. And we can also see this in grave markers. So while these memorials show a desire of the families to prove their connection to the parish, there's also other ways of finding them. So, this isn't just a 19th and 20th century phenomenon. Over summer, thanks to Notre Dame, I was in New York and visited Our Lady of Guadalupe at St. Bernard's Catholic Church on 14th Street. Now, this area had been heavily Irish during the 19th and 20th century, and St. Bernard's was a gem of brick and mortar Catholicism. As the 20th century progressed, however, the area became more strongly Hispanic, while the Irish community, no longer a solidly working class or working in the nearby meatpacking industry, moved out. As the Irish moved out and the Spanish moved in, the Spanish-speaking church nearby became too small. So the churches amalgamated in 2003. And what struck me about this church is that while the interior has been made much more Spanish, there's big paintings everywhere. If you look at the bones of the building, all the stained glass, all the stations of the cross are dedicated to Irish and Irish descended people. There is a small St. Patrick's statue by the exit door. So decades after this stopped being an Irish congregation, an area, the legacy and presence of Irish immigrants and their children live on in the built environment. Moving out of the archive and into spaces that migrants left behind can help to give us a deeper understanding of how they adapted to their new homes abroad and what images and representations of Ireland and Irishness were seized upon at different times. Thank you very much.
Dr. Cooper's talk adds wonderfully to the richness of our discussions yesterday, wide-ranging from Cape Town to the eastern shores of the Chesapeake Bay to Cavan Township, Ontario. Wide-ranging. As we consider the earlier comings and goings of people from this island, we ought to soberly consider the somber truth that they lived and moved in a world built on the trade in human beings and in a world that was being built by those who were kidnapped and forced to work against their will. We are very fortunate to continue our discussion of the movement of people from this island abroad and its relationship to slavery in the presentation we're about to hear from Dr. Briony Widdis.
Good morning, and I want to reiterate Sophie's thanks to Paddy and Liam and to all of the organisers. It's a tremendously warm and lovely conference. So I'm going to talk about Richard Brew, who was an Irishman, and his networks at Anomabo on the coast of Ghana. I've got three objectives for this paper. Firstly, to introduce this collection, this neglected collection of records in the National Archives that I've been working on recently, to outline some of the key recent quantitative findings that I have come across as a researcher of that archive, And thirdly, then, to discuss Richard Brew as one of many Irish identities about whom we can find out more, despite him having been quite well researched already. His Irish roots aren't very well understood. So you may have come across Turtle Bunbury's recent book on the Irish diaspora. In that book, he has a chapter on Richard Brew and his life at Castle Brew. And in that chapter, he draws largely on Priestley, Shumway and Sparks and reuses those. So the point about this slide is that Richard Brew isn't understudied, but his Irish connections are, and the Irish identities within that archive are little known. So this is an example of the kind of papers that I came across, and there's a common understanding that the names of people who were enslaved were erased, and that's very much true within this archive of the people who were transported across the Atlantic, who are only measured quantitatively. But people known as castle slaves or company slaves were listed when they were present working at the fort. So, for example, this document is from Winneba on the coast of Ghana, and it gives the names of men and of women, their employment, their pay, and their value to the company. And so if you look across the columns on the value to the company, you can see that it says value to the company, value for trade, and value worse than nothing. And this particularly struck me because the name of Osaba at the bottom, who was 30, she was a sweeper, and she was recorded as lunatic at times and worth 65 pounds less than nothing. In other words, she was costing the company money to keep. So it makes you wonder then what happened to Osaba. So the Royal African Company of England is where these records come from, and just for those who aren't familiar with the kind of changing structures of the company over time, this is a brief outline. So it was established by Royal Charter in 1663, and through a new charter in 1672 then gained monopoly on trade with Africa among other English companies. But it's lost its trade monopoly and became insolvent in 1696. It was re-established by Act of Parliament in 1750 and then led up to abolition. So the period that I've been working on with these detached papers within T70, which is the series within the National Archives in London, is largely this period of the Company of Merchants Trading to Africa, or CMTA. Quite often people refer to it as the Royal African Company, but really for this period it's a different company. And so my job at the National Archives was to catalogue 94 volumes of unitemised records. And they're very diverse. What was known about them was very limited. They'd never been looked at item level. And over time, these documents have become separated from their parent pieces. Never been sorted before. And that's been a very illuminating process for reasons that I'll come on to in a minute. And during the process of cataloguing the records, I mapped on a Google map, really for my own research purposes, the locations that those documents named, and that really showed up how rich they are as a source for the triangle trade. I also did a literature survey that showed how little used these records have been in the published record. These volumes have been drawn on only about 5 times, or 5 volumes, but 12 times. And so the relevance of this for today, of course, is in relation to the involvement of the Irish in slavery and the enslaved, the lives of the enslaved in Africa and their onward transportation to the Americas. And the reason why this particular series is so important is that previously there's been an understanding that the records don't contain any original letters. So Robin Law, who's the most well-known author on the history of the Royal African Company, says that at PRO, in other words, Public Record Office, or what's now called the National Archives, the letters were not recorded in their full original text, but only in the form of extracts and summaries. And certainly there were extracts and summaries, but the vast majority of the letters are in their original form. So they provide a very rich new source for the study of enslavement on the West Coast. And this is the area in Africa that they mostly deal with. So these are the locations of the forts. Anomabo, a bit about which I'm going to speak, is the marker in purple there. So mostly the coast of Ghana, and also then up into Gambia. But an analysis that I did on Find My Past of close to 56,000 names, so these are names of people rather than items, record items, came across 112 distinct fort names, and some of those are in combination or variations of the same fort names. So this really shows the vast kind of extent of African slavery. We're not talking about a handful of forts through which enslaved people were processed. It's a huge array of different forts in the 1760s. And these are the kind of places that we're talking about. So on the right, Cape Coast Castle, very well known for the door of no return and so on, through which people kind of left the African coast and were sold on to the West Indies and America. The top left is Dick's Cove, Fort Metal Cross as it became known later on, outside of the period that I'm talking about, and Anomabo Fort, bottom left. Cape Coast Castle was the centre of operations, so it's the administrative centre in Ghana of the whole of the Royal African Company, or Company for the Merchants of Trading to Africa's correspondence with London. In terms of the distribution, the chronological distribution of the records, I did an analysis of what's the quantitative distribution of the records held at the National Archives, and you can see that Cape Coast Castle, being the administrative centre, peaks in 1778. So there's a common assumption that in this period, or a common understanding that in this period, slavery was actually decreasing down towards abolition. But actually this shows that the peak of company activity was in the 1770s. And then it peaks again shortly before and after abolition, with the correspondence dealing with the cessation of trade on the coast. In terms of the fort distribution by year, so this is quantitatively how many records, name records, there were in Find My Past in these 56,000 names. You can see that Cape Coast Castle is very important, but actually the largest number of names are associated with Anomabo. And this is important for this presentation because it shows quantitatively how many employees there were at Anomabo. There were in far greater numbers than at Cape Coast Castle, despite that being the centre of operations. And that's significant for the life of Richard Brew and his involvement in the slave trade. So I mean, a lot of my concern has been to try and understand to what extent the presence of these British, Irish and other European names resulted in the obliteration of the names of enslaved people. And in the Find My Past records, the name records record the race as it was recorded in the National Archives records. I should say this is a different set of volumes that Find My Past drew on than the records I've been working on, because it primarily was using passenger lists. So the Royal African Company identified people who were black and who were described as mulatto, in other words, mixed race. And you can see on this record on the right the names, for example, of John Aqua and George Saki, who were assistant black writers. And they were two characters that have been very little written about that I came across, who are very present throughout the series. But the number of names with race descriptions, of these 56,000 names, it's 55,954 to be exact, only 112 names were recorded as black and only 437 as recorded as being mulatto. So that shows you proportionately, despite the fact that the whole purpose of these forts was to trade in enslaved Africans, how little recorded their names were quantitatively. Where race isn't stated, I think we can assume that they were white, by and large. In terms of frequency, so this is an analysis of the occupations overall across those 56,000 names. Soldier was the most frequent, and that's because of the rise in the 18th century of the need for British fortifications on the coast. But this is across all names. And then if you look at the occupations of people who were black and mulatto, you can see that mulattoes were being used as soldiers quite frequently compared to the number of people overall. Whereas for people who were black, they were used in servitude type roles on the whole. So they were black cooper, black hunter. They were artisanal kind of roles. So there was some variation, not completely separate, but some variation in terms of how black and mulatto employees were used. And the reason for that is that mulatto employees were sometimes acknowledged as related to British servants working in the forts. And there are some names. So you can see as well there with the mulatto names, they tend towards, not exclusively, they tend towards using European names, whereas the black names, some of them have retained variations, not entirely, but some of them have retained variations on their African names. In terms of the mention of the word slave across these 56,000 names, it only occurs 8 times, despite the fact that these hundreds of thousands of people in this period were being traded. And that shows you how little recognised and acknowledged people who were enslaved were. So this is quite a well-known fact, but quantitatively showing how limited the mention of the name slave, the word slave, is quite helpful. And you can see that of these 8 times, 3 of them relate to one person, William Webster, who was an overseer of slaves. And the others are companies, the others are enslaved people, company slaves. So Joseph Trespass, William Stepney, and John Thomas, and William Worrell. So the word slave is only used 8 times. 3 of those instances relate to the same person who was an overseer of slaves, and only one of those people was included in a list of passengers. And in contrast to other passengers, no age is available for him. So the others who are present are not, in other words, recorded as having any value, despite being passengers. They're evidently being transported, but they're not recorded as passengers. And none of those people who was named was female. So moving on to women then, as a woman, I found working with the archive quite affecting, because you get such passing references and such brutal references to women. So, for example, this is Arthur Bold, who was a captain, writing to Richard Miles, who was governor at Cape Coast Castle, in a postscript, "I hope you have disposed of my women." And that kind of reference is very, very frequent across the whole archive. I've got some analysis here of women. I mean, I won't read through this slide, but in short, women were named as adjuncts to men. So where men's occupations were detailed in terms of functionally what they were doing, women's occupations were recorded as, captain's wife, wife to Lieutenant Pigott, sergeant's wife, woman, soldier's wife, gunner's mate's wife. So the presence of women was recorded in relation to their relationships with men. And these are the women whose position was much more secure than the vast majority of women who were living in and around the forts. That's just a breakdown of the number of, quantitatively, how many occupations, how frequently occupations occurred across the 56,000 records. And you can see that very few of those are kind of functional occupations. Most of them are as wives, spinsters and widows. So moving on to Irishness then, and Irish identities, and this is kind of a paper that I'm working towards rather than one that I've published so far, because finding the Irish in the records, because these people were identifying as British, because they were working for the Royal African Company, you have to do quite a bit of digging. But Irish commodities were frequently sold. So what was happening was these commodities were bought by the Royal African Company in London, and then the ships were provisioned twice a year to go and supply the forts. And the Irish commodities that were most frequently traded were beef, pork, butter, tallow and linen. So when the invoices refer to Irish provisions, they're talking about beef, pork and butter. And almost exclusively in this period, they're getting beef, pork and butter from Ireland, largely from Dublin. So moving on to Richard Brew then, he was born in Ennis in County Clare in 1725. He married Ellen Chartres in Clare in 1744, arrived on the Gold Coast, what's now called Ghana, in 1745. And moving on, he by 1756 to 60, he's governor at Anomabo, and there's a boom in trade going on. And that trade is very largely due to Richard Brew's connections with the Fante as an interlocutor. And the reason why he was so good at trading with the Fante, which was the most powerful local group, was that he'd married into them. So although he had a wife at home in Clare, Ellen Chartres, he also, and this is an unashamed use of ancestry, he also had a Ghanaian wife. And so this is the Irish side of his family. Just ignore the bit in yellow because that's the African side. But this is his position in Ireland. And these names, Brew, continue to occur across Clare. When I was speaking about this at a recent conference, somebody came up and said, I'm a Brew from Ennis in County Clare. And this is the African side of his family. So he marries Effa Ansa, and with her has 2 daughters, and his will is in the National Archives, and he leaves his estate in Ghana, including his enslaved people, the people who are working for him on the castle in Castle Brew. He leaves that all to his African wife and his 2 African daughters. So I think I missed a slide. No, I haven't. So he marries Effa Ansa at an unknown date, and she's the daughter of Eno Basie Currency, or John Correntee. If you're reading about the Royal African Company, you come across John Correntee's name very frequently. And he lived and died in a luxuriously furnished fort he named after himself, so he called it Castle Brew. And the archive is totally full of, I've only got another 10 slides, the company, the records are absolutely full of his very elaborate, flamboyant writing, with Castle Brew kind of written in this flourish at the top. He's delighted with himself. And it's beautifully furnished with goods that he brings in from London. And he sent his 2 sons with his Irish wife, to be educated in London. But the sending of, he only had daughters with Effa Ansa, but the sending of African British sons to London was also very common in this period. So the understanding that black presence in London was, not happening in that period is completely wrong. And his father-in-law, Eno Basie Currency, John Correntee, was a famous Fante intermediary, extremely powerful, still with powerful descendants living in Ghana. And the reason why he was so powerful was that he had, the Fante, first of all, were a very powerful tribal group in the area, but also they were managing to extract enslaved people from the interior. So they were sending canoes down rivers into the interior of Africa and coercing people to give them up and to be then brought back and traded with European traders. At the coast, and Eno Basie Currency sent his oldest son to be educated in France, and he sent another son, William Anses Sarakou, to study in England. And William Anses Sarakou, who was Richard Brew's brother-in-law, is very well known because he was pictorialised and became famous in London at the time. And the reason why he became so famous was that he was mistakenly sold into slavery. So he's on his way to London. The captain who's looking after him on the ship dies, and then his protection is lost and he's sold. And Currency gets involved with the British on the West African coast and demands that he be released. He's then released, goes to London, and his story becomes dramatised in London as it's Oronuku is the name of the book, and then it's made into poetry and so on. And he's celebrated in London as the Prince of Anomabo. Then returns, and he becomes a writer at Cape Coast Castle. So he himself, William Ansa, appears quite frequently in this particular series of papers. Later on, the British fall out with him because they realise he's not actually going to inherit from Currency, so he's not going to be as powerful as they thought he was going to be. So moving on to kind of Richard Brew's British relationships on the coast. The Miles family, so Richard Miles is a long-standing governor at Cape Coast Castle, and Richard Miles himself has been very little published. So he's got these 2 brothers, Charles and Thomas, who at different stages captain and go out and work on different forts on the coast and under his protection. And there's a very funny series of letters between Richard and Charles. They'd be actually much funnier if it wasn't such horrific material they're dealing with. But Charles is writing to Richard repeatedly, apologising for being so profligate and for having gambled all the money away. And he goes through a series of kind of, I'm very sorry, I won't do it again. And at the end, of each letter, he asks for more money. And they had a sister, Elizabeth Miles, who lives in Wallingford as well and is drawing a private income on a quarterly basis from the company. Richard Miles himself then corresponds frequently with other quite well-known characters on the coast, including Thomas Westgate, Robert Collins, and Jerome Bernard Woves. John Hippisley and Thomas Westgate, this is an objection written by Hippisley, Westgate and Brew together, objecting to the degrading of Captain Bruce, who was a captain working on the coast, and the installation of somebody else, Mr. Langlands, as a writer. So Westgate and Hippisley are also well-published Bristol merchants who gained a lot of wealth. This is a letter from David Hamilton to Brew, and you can see that they're quite good friends because he's saying dear Brew instead of dear sir. So over time you see these relationships develop from being very formal, dear sir, to dear Brew, and then latterly dear Dick. And David Hamilton, I haven't quite tracked down his roots yet, but I suspect he's the Irish Hamiltons and maybe the Killyleagh people or the Scottish Hamiltons. Samuel and Horatio Smith. Samuel Smith was a famous Liverpool dealer, and Horatio was his cousin. And Horatio Smith bought the Castle Brew after Richard Brew's death in he died in 1775, I think. And Horatio Smith then buys the castle. So this is Samuel Smith writing to Richard Miles, who's one of the brother of one of Brew's executors, asking that his cousin Samuel Smith be allowed to buy, or Horatio Smith be allowed to buy the castle, which he then does. Nassau Senior, this is a letter from Nassau Senior to, again, a well-published slave trader, the father of another Nassau Senior of legal fame, an economic philosopher in London and Oxford, writing to Richard Brew. But Richard Brew was very controversial because he keeps changing sides, and it's because he's interested in being a private dealer primarily and for his own financial gain. So this is him. Thomas Trinder is writing about to London about Richard Brew's having dealt with a Dutch sailing ship for 200 slaves, and the reason why he was doing this was that he was undercutting the price of slaves that the British were selling, enslaved people. So he's buying Dutch enslaved people controlled by the Dutch and selling them for less. And his character really comes out everywhere in the record. So this is a poem that I have a little bit of, you might not be able to see it there, but this is kind of very typical Brew. It's doggerel that he's written. I've got a bit of it written out here, so forgive me for a second while I find the right. So he's written this at Winneba in 1774, and he's mimicking this doggerel that was popular at the time, and his contemporaries like Alexander Pope. He's pillorying the Fante for their foppish ways, and this is very interesting because in the archive you see quite frequently very luxurious goods being bought in London for being given as dashies to powerful Africans on the coast. So things like silver swords, beautiful costume, hats, that kind of thing are being given to them in order to induce them to provide enslaved people. But here, Richard Brew is criticising them for being delighted with these goods. He's saying, "Ye God, assist me to describe the folly of a foppish tribe, inured to illnesses and drink, their very breath emits a stink." And this goes on for 2 or 3 pages, this kind of very racist, critical language about the Fante. So in conclusion then, Richard Brew is well studied, but his family connections in Ireland are very little known. It's thought that he may have come from the De Brugge or O'Brien families. His mother was an O'Brien. And the study of the Irish in the Royal African Company or Company for the Merchants Trading to Africa in general has been overlooked. This particular series provides an exciting and very rich source. And also the study of Irish commodities shipped to Africa via London has been very little studied. It's beginning to be tackled now through the work of Kieran O'Neill and others. But despite that, we've got here in this particular set of records, a very quantitatively strong source. Thank you very much.
Those of us who were in this space 16 years ago might recall what I have to characterize as a stunning meditation on the effects of people who remained in Ulster of the emigration that we've been talking about. And the scholar who presented that presentation is someone who, over the long haul, has created a body of work that has been so beneficial to those of us trying to make sense of this tangled history and culture of this place. And so I would welcome Dr. Lunney to the podium.
Thank you very much, Peter, Liam, Paddy. This has been a wonderful symposium, this one, and over the years it has always been good. And yesterday I heard from, I think it was the last speaker, Angela Byrne said, connections are necessary for survival. I thought that, if that could be written in large letters on t-shirts, all of us should be wearing them, because that's what we're all doing. We're examining and making connections. So today I'm doing something a bit different from the paper that Peter so kindly spoke about. Today I'm just going to give you some examples of poetry written in the period by people who emigrated or who were affected by emigration, in their voice, in their words, and I will have to warn you that some of you will not understand much of what I'm going to say. And that in itself makes a very useful point, because it's assumed that migrants from here going to America succeeded because they spoke English, or that was one of the reasons why it was easier for them. When you hear James Orr, you will realize that he wasn't speaking, or did not have to speak, the same language that he encountered in America. He had a different language. So first of all, this is Sarah Leach, who was born in 1809 in Rafo in Donegal. Verses on a young man's departure from Ireland. Through distant lands, think not to roam. For one, your absence will deplore. Be content to live at home upon our pleasant emerald shore. Shall Erin of her sons be reft, year after year in sorrow mourn, and must her daughters fair be left to sigh in vain for their return? And now this is Oliver Goldsmith, who is a well-known poet in the English literature canon, but he knew about emigration from Ireland. He was born probably in County Longford, the year after one of the significant Presbyterian congregational emigrations left from Longford. Not well known, at least I hadn't known much about it. Corboy in Longford was emptied out of Presbyterians in 1729, and Goldsmith was born in 1730. So this is Goldsmith from a very well-known English literature poem. Good heaven, what sorrows gloomed that parting day, that called them from their native walks away, when the poor exiles, every pleasure past, hung round their bowers, and fondly looked their last, and took a long farewell, and wished in vain for seats like these beyond the western main, and shuddering still to face the distant deep, returned and wept, and still returned to weep. And now this is the centerpiece of the poem, of my talk, this poem by James Orr, who is the best poet of Ulster in any period. And I will fight at dawn with anyone, possibly excepting supporters of Seamus Heaney. So this is James Orr, who was born in 1770 and died in 1816. He was from Ballycarry in County Antrim, and he had to emigrate after 1798 rebellion. He came back, so he had experienced the leaving and the return that we were talking about yesterday. I have to draw breath for this. As we were comrades at the time, we moved frae Ballycarry to wander through the woody climb, Burgoyne gie darty Harry. Wi' friends' consent we preed a gill, and mony a house did call at, shook hands and smiled, though elk farewell struck like a mighty mallet our hearts that day. On shore, while shipmates halt, though thranked, wi' lasses' hearts to barter. Neighbours and friends, and boatfa's panged, approach our larboard quarter. Sign speel the side, and doon the hatch, to rest and crack and gaze on the bowls o' berths that mony a ratch maun squeeze in for a season by nicht and day. This is my locker, yoner's jocks, and that old creel sea store is. Those berths beside us are the locks. My uncle's there, afore us. Here hang my tins and vitriol jug. Nae thief's at hand to meddle 'em. Lord, man, I'm glad your ass is snug, but och, 'tis our like bedlam we are this day. All boats ashore, the mate cries stern, wi' oaths would fear a sontie. Now good be we ye, Bryce me bairn, and good be we ye, auntie. What keepsakes and what news are sent? What smacks and what embraces? The hurrying sailors, sleely sglint, drew looks at lang wry faces, fu pale that day. While you heave ho, wi' mony a yell, the birkies weigh the anchor. Ilk mammy's pet conceits itsel the mackin' o' a banker. They'll soon no wish to leave at hame, and dee no worth a totem, when brust and breast and whammel and wame mak some wise men o' Gotham cry halt this day. Some frae the stern, with thoughts o' grief, look back their hearts to Ireland. Some metal bucks to work aye brief, at ends o' rapes or harlan. Some howd aback frae danger's brew, their toddlin' wane no cautious, and some wi' mony a twine and throw do something would be nauseous to name this day. Meanwhile below, some count their beads, while prudes auld lichts at canton. Some mak their beds, some howd their heads, and cry wi' spite, pantin', "Ye brocht us here, ye luckless cough." "Aye, did he whist, my darling? Lord, send me hame wi' poke and staff, I'd beg my brig through Ireland my lane that day." In 2 or 3 days, the mist cam too, few heads were sair or dizzy, and chiels wha scarce a turn could do, be good to be less lazy. At nicht, to tell among ourselves, they crept wi' fondness fidgin' to court, or maybe something else. Give folk became obleegin' atween and day. Round the camboose, what motley bands at breakfast time come swarmin'. Tins, tankards, kettles, pots and pans, the braid flat fire was warming. The good old rule, first come, first served, was urged by men o' metal, and aye when Callans grew mislaird, the arm o' flesh, bus settle lay affray that day. A bonny sicht I vow it was to see on some loon evening the immense, smooth, smiling sea o' glass, where porpoises were steening. To see at nicht the surface fine that Cynthia made her path on, and snove and snore through waves o' brine that sparkled like a heath on a bleeze some day. But noo a gale besets our bark, frae gulf to gulf were tumult, kists, kits, families, and the dark, wi' ae side jerk or jumbled. Some stachrin through a pitch lays lech, some drucket ban the breaker, while surge on surge, say skelps her, hech, 2 or 3 like that'll wreck her a while ere day. Winds, wives, and wains, rampage and rave, 3 score at yints are speaking, while blacks wha a before them drave lie cheapin' like a chicken. What gart us play, or booze like beasts, or box and fairs wi' venom? Hear how the captain laughs and jests, and but a board 'tween him and death this day. 'Tis calm again, while richten things, the heeds o' berths are busied. The seaman chews his quid and sings and pays his friends a visit. Hey, damn my eyes, how is't, good man? Got clear of Davy's locker. Lend me a facer till we land, till blind as Neptune's knocker we'll swig that day. Here, gash ged men, wi' nightcaps on, at yence baith pray and watch, and there for licht sits mony a loon at cards beneath the hatch. Here some sing sangs or stories tell, to others busy knitting, and there some reading to themselves, nodder asleep, while sitting twa-fold that day. Yence mare, luck lees us, plain 'tis now, a murderer in some messes. An English frigate heaves in view, I'll bail her board and press us. Tappies beneath their wives wha stole, or mang old sails lie flat-eye, like whitrets peeping frae their hole, cried, is she British, wot ye, or French, this day? 'Twas but a brig frae Baltimore, to Larne wi' linseed steering. 'Twa days ago she left the shore, let's watch for land appearing. Spies for the shrouds like lake dark clouds, descried domes, mountains, bushes. The exiles grieved, the sharpers thieved, while cronies boozed like fishes, convened that day. When gliding up the Delaware, we cam for Nance, Newcastle. Gapes covered the wharf to gove and stare, while out in boats we bustle. Craters wha ne'er had seen a black, fu scart took to their shankies. Say, wi' our best rags on our back, we mixed among the Yankees and scaled that day. Now the next one is probably a more modern poem. It's anonymous. It is said to have been found in a sheet of paper in a book of poetry in Belfast Central Library. It's possibly by Ernie Scott from Ballynear. He was only a creasy weaver, an ordinary working man. He hadna much in him or on him. He hadna a rood o' land. Nae help to wind the purns. He had neither wife nor wean. In his wee small roadside cottage he lived his lee alane. And clickety-clack went the shuttle as he worked the whole day lang. But into the warp and weft of the web he knew and then wove a song. For he had the gift poetic that brightens the weary time, and filled his heart with gladness and the joy o' the rustic rhyme. He sang o' the hills and the valley, the streams in the leafy glen, and all that cheers the hearts o' our Antrim women and men. But he couldna mak ends meet, scarce grew pritters and meal, and he bade fareweel to the friends he loved and the glens he knew sae weel. And awat o' the States, for the port o' Larne, he sailed out o'er the sea. Like an autumn leaf on the river's drift, torn frae its native tree. He made nae new friends, he sair missed the owl, he couldna settle down. He some way didna fit in, and he roamed frae toun to toun, until in New York he found himself midst deserts of unknown streets. How lonely and sad mang the crowd he felt, for not a kent face he meets. Each face he sees is a stranger's face, and his last wee coin is gone. The nicht was cold, and the rain fell fast, as he lonely wandered on. At last at the door of a public house, he stops to rest his feet, and he huddles close to the sheltering post frae the bitter cold and sleet. He heard the crack of the folk inside, he knew the braid Ulster tongue, but his senses are numbed, and he scarcely heard the sang that the singer sung. What makes him start? Why beams his ee? What makes his heartstrings swell? The song that he hears, the song that they sing, is a song that he made himself. Then Campbell boldly opens the door and eagerly enters then, and he gret wi' joy at the welcome he got frae the kindly Antrim men. And we're coming more modern still. This is W.F. Marshall, who would be well known in this part of the world. He was a Tyrone man who became a minister and lived his life in various congregations in Northern Ireland and died in Castle Rock in County Derry. He was born in 1888 and died in 1959, and is one of the people who first brought scholarly and public attention to the study of emigration. So we should think more about W.F. Marshall. This is called Our Son. He was only a cub, wide-eyed and shy, when he travelled across the sea, but a sorry cub when he said goodbye to the hills of Athenry. Trig and decent he went away, his fortune for to win, and a guid warm suit wi' a muffler grey and a wee round trunk o' tin. But he landed back at the last Carman Fair in the grandest of Yankee clothes, and his specs are such as the Yankees wear, and the chat comes down his nose. And he's big and fat, though I mind him slim, and a waistcoat, white and smart. But by heavens, the luggage that he brought with him made the fool of a donkey cart. Sure, he brought in turf and he fetched to go wi' water the day that he came. But the wife and I, the two of us know, he'll never be just the same. So he's taken a house wi' a bath and a lawn and marble clocks that strike, and he motors to see us off and on, a kind of a stranger like. And this is the final one I'm going to read. Again, we're getting more modern, a different kind of emigration. This is by Derek Mahan, who died in 2020. It's called The Chinese Restaurant in Portrush. Before the first visitor comes the spring, softening the sharp air of the coast, in time for the first invasion. Today, the place is, as it might have been, gentle and almost hospitable. A girl strides past the Northern Counties Hotel, light-footed, swinging a book bag, and the doors that were shut all winter against the north wind and the sea mist lie open to the street, where one by one the gulls go window shopping and an old wolfhound dozes in the sun. While I sit with my paper and prawn chow mein under a framed photograph of Hong Kong, the proprietor of the Chinese restaurant stands at the door as if the world were young, watching the first yacht hoist a sail, an ideogram on sea cloud, and the light of heaven upon the mountains of Donegal, and he whistles a little tune, dreaming of home. Now, as some of you here know, I could talk for a lot longer about the two-edged trauma of emigration, but I think I have only time to say two things about the experience of emigration which these describe so vividly. Number one is, I am certain that I will never come across a poem that rejoices that a son or daughter, friend or neighbour is going to emigrate. And number 3, the story, the James Orr poem, it's a vivid account of the experience of emigration, the excitement, the anticipation, and I think the poem also conveys the impression, certainly as Orr puts it in the mouth of a persona in this poem, that those emigrating from County Antrim in the late 18th century were comforted by the belief that their whole community, or at least a very large proportion of that community, would be or were emigrating. People they knew were going out together and would join others already there. Those births the locks, my uncle's there before us. And you notice that in the poem he keeps talking about we. Or was saying that for many people they hoped that the community would re-establish itself on the other side of the ocean. The familiar community, and for many of them that was a covenanted community in the religious and also in a social sense. They were people bound together by religious covenant, by kinship, and by residential ties. I know we talked about how movement was natural. So also as sitting together in church. That meant a lot to the people who were leaving. And they knew that Presbyterian congregations had gone together from Achadui in 1718, from Corboy in 1729, and most crucially from Orr's area going to South Carolina with the Reverend William Martin. People went together. It would be a community they hoped would be re-established. That took a lot of the pain out of emigration. However, look again at the last line, the last 2 lines of the poem that I just read. We mixed among the Yankees and scaled that day. To scale is to scatter, as the basic meaning of scaling is to stand on the back of a cart and throw shovelfuls of earth. Or is saying these people went like scaling earth. There is no way that that earth can ever reunite in the same way again. And those lines are sad. And they also forcibly remind me of, in their tone and rhythm, of 2 lines from another Orr poem, which is called The Irish Cottier's Death and Burial. In that poem, after the burial of the old man, his friends and neighbours, after the shared experience of the funeral, depart from the graveyard, and the verse finishes, then through the gate they passed to their different homes. And I think possibly, or unconsciously or deliberately, is echoing these 2 experiences when people separate after a shared experience. People leaving the body of the old man in the graveyard go from the gate in different directions. Having experienced emigration himself, Orr knows that emigration means the death and burial of the old life. And he understands that those who survive the journey away from the old life left behind have no choice but to separate, to try to find new places to belong, new homes. Like an autumn leaf on the river's drift, torn for its native home, there can be no reunion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linde. That was brilliant. Really appreciate that. We have time, it appears, for questions, discussion. However, I will not entertain condemnation of the chair and his partner in viciousness.
Someday I'll picture this when I'm far away from this place. There'll be oceans divide us, but I'll keep inside me this time and space. Soon I may fade away, like the sun falling down in the west at the end of the day. And I'll be a ghost of your memory. Some say the heartbeat and soul of this land are like waves that wash on the shore. But the blood in my veins pushes me to believe there has to be something more. Now is the hour, now is the day. Take what we gather and set on our way, and hope for what's better. That's what people say, but words can't do nothing to keep tears away. We'll come by the mountains, cross over the streams, walk in the footsteps of others who've dreamed. Take your bag from the fire, your coat by the door, keep a light in the window, home, to find a way home. Home, to find a way home. One day I'll learn to breathe, far away from these rolling seas, and I'll pray time erases and heartache it eases its chains on me. It could be London, Glasgow or New York. You pass me by on the street, like a word on the page, fading with age, that I've written but no one will read. Now is the hour, now is the day. We take what we gather and set on our way, and hope for what's better. That's what people say, but words can't do nothing to keep tears away. Come by the mountains, cross over the streams, walk in the footsteps of others who've dreamed. Take your bag from the fire, your coat from the door, keep a light in the window. Take your bag from the fire,